So you've probably just all had a button come up on screen to say that the recording's started. Welcome to the session. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so hopefully you can all see that nice and clearly. This session is an introduction to professional communication, and that's going to include a couple of different aspects that we're going to kind of have a whistle-stop tour over this next hour. I have a background in delivering training courses in person and online on a whole range of topics: leadership development, communication, conflict resolution and well-being. I ran a session last week on an introduction to leadership, and the recording for that will be available at some point soon. I hope to do it in an interactive way where possible. I know this is a webinar style, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions, drop things in the chat and participate, do feel free to do so, because that will help me tailor the session to you. Similarly, if you've come to this session with particular questions or something you're really wanting to get out of it, feel free to put that in the chat now, so that as we go, I can try and link it in as wherever possible. As a little bit of an overview of what we're doing today, I'm going to start by going over the concept of active listening. Although communication, you might be thinking about speaking, listening is a really important starting point. We're going to talk a bit about boundaries in terms of being professional in the way that we communicate, and that ties into confidentiality. And to round off, I'm going to take you through a model of what's called nonviolent communication. And that will help in terms of, I guess, when you're having a difficult conversation with a colleague in a professional setting, but it's also just a really handy way of framing your communications. So hopefully you'll see later how that will become useful in whatever professional roles you take on, whether it's a role with the student union. I know some of you might be thinking about officer roles, but any job that you go into, any role that you do, will benefit from these communication tools. So to get started then, I want to show you this symbol. This is, or I'm led to believe, this is the Chinese Mandarin symbol for active listening. And I like to show this because for me, it captures what listening really means. A lot of people, I guess I train adults as well as students and young professionals. And when I teach older adults about listening, they think, I've been around a bit, I'm experienced, I know how to listen. But hearing and listening are different things. Listening is not just the sound going into your ears. So if you break down this symbol, there are actually different parts. Yes, there's ears, but actually listening involves your eyes, your attention, and your heart. And when you put these things together, what we're really saying in active listening is that we have to be watching, we have to include our body language, our non-verbal communication. We have to fully attend. So, there may be situations where you're sort of listening to somebody, but you're multitasking, and so that's not active listening. And the open heart aspect of this is quite nice, because that adds the extra layer of empathy, which is really, really important if we want to have a respectful communication with somebody. Stephen Covey is I guess, an expert in the field of leadership, and he talks a lot about personal effectiveness habits. And I really like this quote: "The greatest communication issue we have is that we listen to reply instead of listening to understand." And what he's saying there is that quite often in our work, in our personal lives, we're listening to pick out the bits that are interesting to us so that we can interrupt and ask questions, so that we can, I guess, get our bit done. And that's limiting us, really. And he said, really, if you want to be an effective individual communicator, you have to seek first to understand the other person, then to be understood yourself. You have to empty them of what it is they're trying to communicate. You have to understand their message fully before you communicate your own message. And so active listening is really about that understanding element. So if we want to actively listen, we need to be open-minded and curious. And that's different to being, say, judgmental or opinionated. Open-minded is just wanting to know what it is the other person's trying to share. Asking good open-ended questions is important for helping out understanding. It allows the other person a chance to explain themselves well. Empathizing with somebody else is about putting yourself in their shoes. And I guess what I mean by that is, instead of thinking, this is how I would feel about that situation, this is what it means to me, you kind of place that to one side and ask, well, what might it mean to the other person? Based on what they've told me, based on what I know about them, how might they feel about this? What might they be thinking about it? And that's going to be really important in a professional role, because every team member will have different motives, different ways of working, and empathizing with their style and what it is they're trying to achieve will help you have a smoother communication. Active listening often involves body language. We live in interesting times at the moment where, you know, I'm on a call now with 16 of you, and there's absolutely no body language because you've all got your cameras off, which is absolutely fine. But it does change the way we communicate. And we get a lot of information from facial expressions, from the way people gesture, move their arms, from their eyes. And so if you are in a situation where you're trying to actively listen without body language, you have to work all the harder. So those of you who are taking up roles now that are remote, it's worth bearing in mind that you'll have to practice a bit more. You might rely on tone of voice to help you with that extra bit of understanding of the other person's mood, their emotions. And another thing we can do to show that we're actively listening is to summarize, clarify, and paraphrase. And I'm just going to show you a little bit about what that looks like, because they're all similar but different. They all serve the purpose of helping the person you're listening to know that they've been understood. Just to reiterate for people who've just come to the session, do feel free to ask any questions at any point by dropping them in the chat or by unmuting. If you put them in the chat, I'll read them out anonymously and answer them as we go. So a really good skill to show that you're listening is, I guess, saying something back to that other person to show you've understood. You can summarize, which is saying their words back to them, a short version of what they said. You can paraphrase, which is where you change the words slightly. So it's not word for word what they said, but it's your understanding of it, similar words. Or you can clarify, which is where you ask a question, such as, oh, am I right in thinking you meant this? Or are you saying? So I'll give you an example of what that might look like. Let's say in a work scenario, somebody says to you, I'm finding this project really challenging. It seems like the deadline is a while away, but because I've so many other conflicting jobs to do, I just can't seem to get started with it. If we were summarizing, we would pick out a few of their key words, not the whole paragraph, just a little bit. So we might say to them, all right, you can't get started because of the conflicting jobs. So I've picked out the bit about getting started, the bit about conflicting. If I'm paraphrasing, I interpret it in my own words instead. So I might say, oh, it sounds like you're juggling a lot of demands. The message is hopefully the same, but the choice of words is different. And that can be quite interesting, because when you paraphrase what somebody else has said, it gives them the opportunity to agree or disagree. They might say, yeah, you're right. Or they might say, no, I'm not really juggling, because I'm not doing them at the same time. I'm doing them one after the other, but there's too many of them. So it gives them the opportunity to, I guess, move into a clarification of what they said. Clarifying is usually asking a question. So in this example, we might say, so is it the project or managing your tasks that are challenging? So we've noticed that in their paragraph, they've picked up on two different issues, and we're asking a question to find out a little bit more. And the purpose of all three of these listening skills is to make sure that you yourself have understood what the other person is trying to communicate, but also to show them that you're understanding them. People feel quite respected when you can show you understand. When I cover this with some people, they initially say they're worried about it coming across as patronizing. Obviously, if you repeated back everything somebody said to them, they'd find it a little bit overbearing and patronizing, but just taking key snippets actually helps them know that you've really listened. So I hope that makes sense. As I said, do stop me at any point if you need me to explain more, give more examples, or have questions. Other skills that are involved in listening, and I'm just going to tell you about them, which I appreciate is not the same as practicing them, but these are things that you'll learn by doing. Building rapport is about having kind of a two-way relationship that feels open. I've used the word resonance there, and that's about people really feeling that they're on the same wavelength. So you probably see it in, movies when they're doing a romantic scene where people are on a date. When one person leans in, the other person leans in too. They just seem to be in tune with each other's gestures. You also have it in friendships, in work relationships, where ideas just bounce in a kind of effortless way. And so rapport is promoted by feelings of openness, and often by body language, to show that we're nodding at each other, we get where each other are coming from. And that can be a little bit harder to develop online. Not impossible, but harder. So you may find yourself second guessing whether, oh, does that person understand what I mean in this email? Am I getting on with them? I don't know if it's quite working out, because you've not got those cues. In which case it can be worth having a phone call or a cameras on video call, just to get those extra cues, to get a sense of whether your message is landing with that other person or not. Empathy is a really important listening skill. I've mentioned it already, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. That helps to build respect, and it just helps you to make sure that when you're saying your message, you've thought about their opinion and their standpoint, because sometimes you may have conflicting goals. You may want to do things in different ways, and the more both of you empathize with each other, the easier it will be to negotiate. Practicing non-judgment, which I'll talk about a bit more later, is trying not to label other people. As you're listening, it can be very easy to have a voice inside your head saying, oh, that's not the way I do it, or, oh, they've been a bit lazy, or whatever it is. That label distracts you from genuinely listening. So practicing non-judgment is just noticing that, okay, I've got my own opinion in my head, but I'm going to put it to one side for the time being, so that I can be fully present with this person. Giving the other person time to speak is an important listening skill. We can try sometimes to get things done too quickly, so we butt in, we ask questions, and sometimes those questions are valid and useful, but making sure they're done at the right point when somebody's finished expressing their thought, again, just helps to show that respect. Asking good questions, and this can be a whole webinar in itself. If you want to learn about coaching, that's all about questioning. But there's a big difference between saying, are you happy, which is a yes, no, versus tell me how you're feeling, or how do you feel about this project, which allows somebody to express themselves in a more open way. So all of the skills of listening really are skills that build up a respectful relationship. And that's why I wanted to put this in about professional communication, because hopefully all of your communications are respectful, with friends, with family, with colleagues. But with colleagues in particular, being able to do things in a respectful manner will just keep things more harmonious. It will avoid conflicts. So again, I hope that all makes sense. I've not seen any questions come through in the chat, so I'm going to move on to the next section, which is on professional boundaries. And a boundary really is a line that shouldn't be crossed. And often this comes up in industries where there are, I guess, more defined roles. So the classic is a doctor and a patient. You will have in your mind, a list of things that the doctor and patient can and can't do. And the reason they can't do those things is to protect the integrity of the doctor, as well as protecting the rights of the patient. But there are also professional boundaries in working relationships as well. Sometimes they're very clear. You might have to sign a code of conduct telling you what you can and can't do. But there are also unwritten boundaries. There are kind of social boundaries that we probably intuitively know, but it's just worth saying them out loud and making them a little bit more clear. Sometimes we might cross a boundary, and that's where we do something outside of our professional role, but it's not a problem. So for instance, quite frequently, there are colleagues I have who I've known for long enough that on my emails to them, I might use emojis or I might link them into a joke, which is not professional behavior. It's crossing that boundary, but it doesn't cause any harm because I know that that relationship is fine because of the time and work we've put into getting to know each other. Boundary violations are when something crosses a line and it does harm. So for instance, with the doctor-patient relationship, you might have it where, the doctor asks the patient out on a date. That's totally not allowed, very problematic behavior. In a workplace setting, perhaps if you're messaging a client or an external agency, and there's gossip in there, or there's something, that they shouldn't have seen, that could violate a boundary. I realise that this can sound a bit heavy and intimidating. As I said, most of the time we've got a good awareness of what these boundaries are anyway, and we're very good at keeping to them, but it's just worth mentioning out loud. There are different types of boundary that we can be aware of. So there's our personal information, things like your address, telephone number, social media details, religion, political leanings. There are certain types of information that are protected, and they are only known by the people who need to know them. So for example, to sign up to this workshop, you've probably given York Student Union your email address only for this purpose, and then that data gets moved out again. I don't have access to that information because I'm just the trainer. And so when we're sending communications, it's important to bear in mind that we have to anonymize things. We have to be careful who gets access to what data, because it's protected under GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. So if ever you're sharing documents in a work setting, it's worth having a look through. Is there any data on here that needs removing, needs redacting before it's passed on? There are physical boundaries, not so much at the moment in COVID times, but in an in-person setting, we would perhaps expect to handshake a colleague or client, but we wouldn't necessarily hug them. And so there are things, and even if you might handshake, it's possible that if somebody's of a different religion or have different, personal preferences, that they would like not to make that contact as well. So that's worth bearing in mind for, in-person office contact when you get around to that. There's a boundary of kind of where and when you do things. So it would be very reasonable for me to send an email to a member of York Student Union staff at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to say, let's book a session in. But if I sent a Facebook message at 3 in the morning, that would cross boundaries. It might not necessarily upset the person, but it wouldn't be a good idea because it could damage the relationship, because it's just not got that professional feel to it. We have emotional boundaries, and these are probably the ones that aren't talked about as much. And that can include things like oversharing personal examples, or perhaps being under-involved in meetings and discussions, not willing to share enough. You can imagine if you're in a group scenario coming up with campaign ideas and somebody's not talking at all, You know, maybe there's an emotional reason, but maybe that withdrawal is a sign of a problem. So we have to be careful that when we're involved in group settings, we're sharing enough to get things done, enough to bond, but we're also giving people the space that they need. I'm sure you'll have heard that some people are more extroverted. They like to be lively, active, talkative. And some people are more introverted. They maybe take a little bit of time because they like to think. And so an emotional boundary might be not pressuring anybody to share before they're ready, and also making sure that if you're a big talker, you're remembering to stop and let other people speak as well. You can have material boundaries, which is about maybe the resources that you share and have access to, the budget that you have. So when you get into a role, you'll probably have a line manager who will tell you what you can and can't access, what you can and can't use for your projects. Intellectual boundaries include things like, you know, if somebody's come up with an original idea, it might be their intellectual property or copyright. We have the right to free speech as long as it doesn't cross the boundaries of people's, you know, human rights or deliberately offending people as well. And there will be legal or policy boundaries. So things like a job contract, a code of conduct, GDPR is a policy. You know, it's a legal boundary as well as encompasses personal information. By the way, after this session, you will be emailed some resources. So all of these will be written down with a little summary. And again, this is just for you to bear in mind. It's not something you might immediately implement. You don't have to worry about it, but it's just things to think about when you're communicating. Again, feel free to unmute and ask questions or drop things in the chat. So what I'll do now is just show some examples of, you know, professional communications you might see, and I'm going to invite you to participate if you'd like and just have a think about, are there any boundary issues? Are there any issues of professionalism with these examples? So somebody sending an email here. Hi, Craig. As discussed, a friend of mine, Alia, ran a similar mental health campaign for her campus last year. I've got a copy of her slides, which I figured we could just rebrand for our campaign. See attached. Let me know what you think and if we need to plan a meeting to discuss next steps. Regards, Pete. I'm hoping that those of you on the call are here and want to have a go at this. Does anyone want to unmute or drop in the chat anything they've noticed about what's good about this communication, what could be a problem? I'll give it a minute in case you want to, and then if not, I'll read out. Okay, lovely. I can see an example in the chat. Potential violation of intellectual boundaries, and somebody else has added, isn't that plagiarism? Yep, spot on with the issue here. So the tone in which this is written is absolutely fine and professional. The message is very clear, but just copying somebody else's material is problematic. This is just a made up example. Potentially the person sending this email has permission, but if they don't, it's a problem. So if ever you're wanting to utilize somebody else's resources, you'd have to ask for it. Thank you to those people who dropped things in the chat there. Different examples. So perhaps on a Facebook account, we've got two work colleagues having a discussion. You know, we've got the end of a joke, and then later on in the conversation, since you're here, can you look at the report I just emailed over to you? Again, I'll wait and see if anything comes through on the chat. And this is quite interesting because I guess for a lot of people these days, you will have work colleagues, you know, interacting with you in social spaces. So we've got being too pushy as a good example in the chat. Yeah, so that could be considered an emotional boundary, but depending on what it is, pushing somebody. It might be an inappropriate time to discuss work. Spot on there, yeah. and possibly an inappropriate platform as well. Again, it depends on the relationship. Sometimes if you know a colleague well, they won't mind you asking on the end of a message, but on the whole, it's better to separate work material and personal communication into separate places. So yeah, could be pressurizing outside of working hours. Hey Lily, so I just read your campaign draft and it kind of sucks a little. Have you even costed up the manpower and resources it would take? No way the trustees will approve it like this. It's too much of a state. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but if I were you, I'd scratch it and start again. Yeah, we're straight on that one in the chat. I can see people picking up that the language is unprofessional, the tone of it is unprofessional, problematic. So side note, it's got a very poor subject line as well. You'd want to make clear on your emails exactly what the topic is. The message, although worded terribly, is not the problem. It's okay to challenge somebody on an issue, but obviously the way you do that is very important if you're going to come across as a professional and if you're going to avoid a conflict. Okay, so a social media post here, just been in the office brainstorming some new campaign ideas, looking forward to planning our Safe at Night week, pencil in the 14th to 21st of October for some interesting events, workshops, and maybe even some guest speakers. Watch this space. We're all quiet in the chat on this one. Bit of a trick one. So in my opinion, this one is fine. So I just wanted to show you an example that would be okay. In some roles, you know, especially if you're going to be an officer or representing different parts of the union, you might have a work social media account where you are promoting things. And so just making sure it's clear, it's on the right channel, and that you're using a nice general tone for anybody that comes across that post is absolutely fine. Okay, I think this is the last one. So a student volunteer messaging somebody in an officer role. Hey, great to meet you at the volunteering fair. Did you find all that you needed? Nice to meet you too. Yeah, it was a great event. I could do with some advice on applying for a role. I'm a bit nervous. Oh, I'm sure you'll be great, but I can help you out if you like. That's sweet, thanks. Could you help me take a look over the community rep role? Sure thing. How about you buy me a drink and I'll look over your application. Friday at 7:30 p.m. works for me. So again, I'll just give you a minute for some thoughts on this one. Okay, lovely. So somebody's put in the chat a boundary violation because it's initiating a relationship or date or definitely a social interaction. Could be seen as taking advantage of their request. Definitely. I think that last message about buying a drink and looking over the application is the issue. If it had stopped before then and just said, yes, come to the SU office at 3 o'clock or whatever it is in working time, it, you know, you could understand this and it wouldn't be so much of an issue. This might be better on a work platform. You know, if this is a personal messenger or a private message, again, you'd need to check with whatever contract, whatever agreement. Sometimes there are rules about where you can speak to students. This starts off well and supportive, but it begins to become informal, and yes, it crosses that boundary. So it could make the other person feel very uncomfortable, or the other person could be very happy with that arrangement, and then they end up both getting into a boundary crossing issue. So thanks for going through those examples. Hopefully that kind of clarifies or illustrates what those boundaries mean. Just a bit on confidentiality. When you're speaking to people just in an interpersonal way, so colleague to colleague, you may be familiar with something called the Chatham House rules. And that's a situation where you can say kind of what happened, but not who said it. So I can tell you, I was in a team meeting earlier today when somebody talked about the difficulties of safeguarding online. or, you know, somebody was speaking to me about a mental health issue that concerned me. You don't know who I'm talking about. I'm just telling you what happened. And so that's absolutely fine. In terms of an organizational level, if you are, you know, taking on a formal role with your student union, it might be that you get certain information, such as, you know, high-level strategies, budgets, when people are going to be hired for new roles. There might be certain bits of information that are released to you that are not yet public information. And so there's confidentiality in a professional sense, and it's always worth finding out what can and can't be shared. And if you're not sure, assume that it can't be shared until you have checked. The two exceptions in terms of confidentiality are whistleblowing, and this is where you suspect there's some sort of unsafe or illegal activity. So there are always examples in the news of a company who's, you know, they've decided they're going to cut corners on health and safety, or they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, and one worker breaches confidentiality to tell the police or a governing body, I'm worried about something. Hopefully that won't come up, because I'm sure people are doing all the right things. The other time you might breach confidentiality is if there's a safeguarding issue. So if somebody tells you something that makes you worry that they're in danger or risk of harm, you might then pass that on to police, social services, emergency healthcare, things like that. Again, I doubt it's going to come up often, but it's just worth bearing in mind that that is an appropriate time to pass on information. And if you're ever not sure, you will have a member of staff linked to you who will be able to support you with that. So, you know, when you get into your role, they will be your point of contact for anything that you want to check. Any other questions or comments before I move on? Again, this probably sounds like a big topic, but it's probably just over preparing you rather than, you know, glossing over it. Okay, can't see anything in the chat, so I shall shuffle on. So in terms of communicating professionally, just another couple of really quick tips. Proofread your communications for technical errors, but also how they sound. Sometimes reading out loud is very helpful. Also proofreading with a delay. So for instance, I wrote a document for a website the other day and then read it the day after, and it wasn't until the day after that I realized how many errors I'd made, because in the moment when you're writing, you don't always notice them. Tailor your communications. I would write my emails differently to different people. You know, is it a completely new client? Is this somebody I know well? And tailor how you speak to them. You know, it might be that certain people you can just send, you know, a quick email without a very detailed explanation, whereas other people you need to introduce who you are. There's all those kinds of things to think about. Choosing the right platform. You know, it might be that you send an email or you phone somebody. In some cases, you might even have to write a letter. You know, we do less of that these days, but some things are better posted and in writing if they're very formal. Sometimes it's just so much easier to talk to people. So I've been back and forth communicating with Emma to set up these sessions. And for some logistical things, it's very easy to put things in an email, like here's the Zoom link or what time should we start? But other times it's easier to pick up the phone and just get that sense of what people mean, what they're hoping for. Some things are a bit harder to communicate in writing because you're missing out on those nonverbal signals and the tone of voice. Ask for help. If you don't know the answer to something, it's fine to say, I'm not sure, I'll find out and get back to you. If you're not sure if the tone of something is right or the best way to communicate with somebody, speak to your linked member of staff and they will kind of help you through that process. And I know I've thrown a lot at you, but underneath all of it, you've still got to be you. As you get into your professional role, you'll find a style of communicating that is still who you are. And that's really important for building up those good working relationships with people. Send communications within work hours. Sometimes I run my own business and I might work on something at 7 in the evening. I might draft the email at night, but then schedule it for the next morning so that the other person gets it in working hours. So if you do like to work more flexibly, just bear in mind that the person receiving it might want to receive it in working hours as well. It might be worth separating your work and social communications. So, you know, if there's a colleague you're talking to about a work issue and then you want to invite them to an after work Zoom party, you might do that in a separate email. Time personal messages, so to things that are not work related, to be sent in breaks or outside working hours. Never send any work documents via personal channels. That can end up with, you know, accidental GDPR breaches and all sorts of mess. So it's important that those things go through whatever work channel you've got. Try and avoid gossip, because things are monitored more than you think and it can come back on you. And even outside of work, just have a little think about your language, tone and humour. You know, you can picture people who've been on a work night out and done something they shouldn't have done, and it has affected their relationships in the workplace as well. So I'm not saying don't be you, don't be authentic, but just bear in mind those boundaries will carry into social spaces as well. Right, I'm going to jump into a new topic now, which is the nonviolent communication. And I absolutely love this. It's really, really useful for how to structure conversations, how to raise issues politely, and how to deal with possible conflicts. Again, you'll be sent some resources afterwards so that if you want to have a go at this yourself, it will take you through the flow of everything you need to do. As a little bit of background, this was developed by Marshall Rosenberg in the 1960s and it's still going strong today. Highly recommend the book, and the reference will be on the sheet that you get. And he said that, well, violence is acting in ways that result in hurt or harm, whether that's deliberate or not. So it can be physical violence, but it can be verbal. And so for him, non-violent communication is a way of communicating that avoids that hurt or harm. And he said, in order to avoid that, we have to be wanting to give from the heart. We have to want to communicate in an empathetic way. So there are kind of 4 steps really that I'm going to take you through. And what he's trying to do with these 4 steps is avoid classifying and judging people, because that promotes violence. He says that really when people are in a conflict or power struggle, they've got an unmet need. And so if we can empathize with other people's experiences, we recognize our common humanity and then we can get over the issue. So I'm going to work through this example with you, which you might have in a workplace setting. Last week, I asked Sarah to write a report for me. She's been swanning in late all the time and gossiping over lunch. Why do things always take her so long? Then when she finally gets it to me, an hour before the end of the day, I see there are spelling mistakes on the first page. She's so sloppy, I shoved it back on her desk and told her to book up her ideas. You can picture somebody in a workplace having this rant to another colleague. This is a low-level conflict, and we're going to apply the nonviolent communication model to it. First thing, again, in the chat, very quickly, what is this? Okay, 1 or 2 of you playing along. Second question, a bit harder. What is this? Okay, so we're very happy with pen. Pen is easy, and I've managed to catch people out, which I'm pleased about. We've got angry old man and grumpy man, which illustrates the first part of the model, which is to make an observation instead of an evaluation. What you did with the second picture, and it's very human nature to do, is we've labeled this person as angry or grumpy. And it's possible that this person is feeling angry or grumpy, but when we label and judge people, it can come across as critical and it can escalate a conflict. So we might evaluate people by saying whether things are good or bad. We might put a label on somebody that they're lazy, they're proud. Sometimes we evaluate by comparing people, you know, smarter, faster, better, dumber, whatever that is. And sometimes we evaluate by exaggerating the amount time. So we might say things like, oh, they always do this. And maybe it's not true that they always do. We're using that to kind of tell our own story, if that makes sense. So what I've got on screen are some example sentences. I'm actually going to launch the poll because that's probably a bit easier. And with each one of these statements, I want you to tell me if it's an evaluation, which is you kind of labeling or judging, or whether it's an observation, which is a factually accurate statement of what's going on. So I've opened the poll. It should have come up on your screen. I'll give it a minute or two for those who want to have a go at it. There are 6 examples. She disrespected me. Steve procrastinates. David didn't ask for my opinion during the meeting. Sarah never listens to me. And Faisal told me that I was lazy, and my father is a good man. You might have to scroll down to see all of the options. So I can see that 3 people have done it so far. And it is trickier than it looks. I can see some mixed responses coming in here, which is fine. If you are having trouble with it, don't worry too much because we'll go over it on the screen afterwards. Okay, so I think I've got 6 people in, and I think that might be all we're going to get. 7. Oops. So I'm going to stop it there and just show you what came through, and we'll talk about it as we go. So she disrespected me. This one is an evaluation, and that's because what the word disrespect means different things to different people. So by saying that, I'm evaluating that it was disrespectful to me. And so we might rephrase that by saying exactly what she said. She called me arrogant, or whatever it is. That would make it a more observational statement instead. Steve procrastinates. 5 of you have said that's an observation, but actually it is still an evaluation. We're still judging that he procrastinates. Because again, what that means to us might be different to what it means to another person. If we wanted to rephrase that, we might say, Steve studies for exams the night before. That could be factually true without using procrastinate, which is a labeling word. David didn't ask for my opinion during the meeting. I think we're on it with that one. 6 of us have said that's an observation, which is quite right. Again, if it's factually true, it's an observation. Sarah never listens to me. That's an evaluation. Well done, 6 of you said that. Because of that word never, it's perhaps over dramatizing. So if we wanted to make it more like an observation, we might say the last 2 times I told Sarah about my day, she was texting at the same time. So we're clarifying in what way we don't feel listened to. Faisal told me that I was lazy. This one's a tricky one. We're kind of split between evaluation and observation. This is an observation in the sense that, is it true Faisal said that? He may be evaluating me, but the fact that he said that is an observation. That actually happened. And the last one, my father is a good man. We're all spot on there. That's an evaluation. That would mean different things to different people. And so if we wanted to make it an observation, we would have to say why we think he's a good man. Is it that he gives income to charity? Is it that he, you know, listens to my troubles? Is it a whole number of different things? So the idea of looking at that really is to help us go back to our conflict situation and get rid of any evaluations or judgments. Can we rephrase it? So I've highlighted a few things here. Saying things like, oh, somebody's been swanning in, is labeling the way they enter the room to make it sound like they don't care. Coming in late all of the time is probably an over-dramatization. She's sloppy. Well, what does sloppy mean to me? So the first thing to do in a nonviolent communication setting is to take these out and just be factual. Imagine that you're replaying the issue back on a video camera. So instead I might say, last week I asked Sarah to write a report for me. This week she's been 10 minutes late 3 times. I noticed that tasks take her longer than they would take me to do. She gave me the report at 4 p.m. and I saw spelling mistakes on the first page. I shoved it back on her desk and told her to book up her ideas. Now that last sentence sounds like an evaluation, but because it's me evaluating my own behavior, it's okay. It's evaluating the other person that causes a conflict. I know I'm going through this quite quickly. Do feel free to stop me or ask questions, if you need more examples or if it doesn't make sense. What we've done here is we've taken the issue and tried to make it more factual. The next thing to do is to work out what feelings are going on for people. When I'm in a conflict, when the other person's in a conflict, they will be in an emotional state and that will affect the way they communicate. And sometimes we say thoughts as feelings. So we might say, oh, I feel like I'm living with a brick wall. What we actually mean there is I feel ignored, or I feel like this relationship is not loving, or something like that. When we say I feel like it's useless, that's not a feeling, that's a thought. How we might actually feel is sad, dejected. We might feel exhausted. So it's important that we label our feelings correctly. And so to do that, again, in the resources that I'll send you afterwards is a feelings bank where we can get into the nitty-gritty of what words we might be experiencing. Because if we can express how we feel, and we can also think more carefully about how the other person feels, we're more likely to have a smooth communication. And then we can use something called I statements. So these ways of phrasing things, I'm sure you can agree, can come across a bit confrontational. You made me angry, they wound me up, she made me cry. They put the power and the responsibility onto the other person, which might escalate it, but it also means that you lose your personal control in the relationship. And so rephrasing them with the word I statements, helps you take ownership of your feelings. So I was angry that the files weren't organized. I was trying to concentrate, so I found their chatter frustrating. I always cry when people comment about my ability to do my job. Now I'm not putting the blame on them, I'm just kind of making a factual observation of my feelings. Then we have to work out what are the unmet needs that led to those feelings. So my mum and dad would often have arguments about a cup of tea. My dad worked from home and my mum was a housewife, and he would make himself a cup of tea and not offer to make one for her. And it would lead to an amusing but low-level conflict. And really that's because each of them needed something from that situation and they weren't getting it. My dad needed the autonomy of just being able to get on with his day. And my mum needed a show of affection in the form of a cup of tea. People don't always know how to express what it is they need. So again, I'm going to send you afterwards a word bank of all the different things we might need. There's a whole host of different things there. I'm not going to talk through them now because I'm wary of finishing on time. But we can add this into the I statements so that we're saying what it is we needed from that situation. I was angry that the files weren't organized because I value order and structure. Order and structure are the needs. I was trying to concentrate, so I found their chatter frustrating. I needed to feel respected. So maybe the fact that people are talking around them is a sign of disrespecting their understanding of the world. I always cry when people comment about my ability to do my job because it affects my level of self-respect and my sense of belonging. So we needed belonging. this puts steps 2 and 3 together now. So, you know, going back to this example of somebody who's turning up late and has done the report wrong, the person who's got the issue might say, you know, what did they feel? What were their unmet needs? Maybe Sarah was frustrated or agitated because she needs to feel that her team is competent. Maybe she needs the security that things are done with extra time in case there are errors and edits to make. Maybe she needs to feel a sense of trust with her colleagues. Again, it's a made-up example. I couldn't tell you which one she actually felt, but there's a whole range of options, which is why we can't assume. We need somebody to tell us. And the final step, which is really important, is to request a solution. What is it you actually want to happen? If you know how you feel and you know what you need, you can then move forwards. And using phrases like this, would you be willing to, would you like to, it would help me if, is very useful. These are phrased as requests. If we demand, then people, you know, are likely to resist it, or they'll agree under, you know, they'll comply, but they don't really respect the relationship if they're forced. If you're vague, that can be a problem. You know, if you say, oh, I'd like things to be better, well, what does better look like? Or better to you might not be better to somebody else. And it's important to say what you do want. You know, if you turn around and say, I'd like you to stop shouting, well, does that mean you want me to be quiet? Would you like me to talk in a soft voice? Do you want me to go away? So don't say what you don't want, say what you do want. So in this scenario, perhaps it would help me if you could hand work in earlier. Or would you mind updating me on your progress as you go so I know if I need to support you? So this is almost like the end of the communication. We've said, this is the problem, this is the way I feel, and now I'm saying it would help me, this is what I need to get better in future. To sum up those 4 points, we observe what's going on, we identify how we feel, we identify what our needs are, and then we suggest a solution. Just to see what that might look like in terms of professional communication, we might say, you know, you might send an email like this to somebody. In the meeting, I didn't get to share my suggestions because people talked over me. I felt rejected because it's important that I belong to the team. Would we be able to make some time for me to share my ideas? You know, that's only 3 sentences split across the 4 parts, but that follows the nonviolent communication process to the letter. And hopefully you can see it's a very polite, but also assertive way of saying, here's the issue and here's what I'd like to happen. And so this is so useful in the workplace for dealing with those low-level conflicts. Another different example, earlier you called me bossy when I suggested that you take on a task. I felt self-conscious and insecure, especially as a woman in the workplace. I'd like to feel respected by this team and that I've got the same independence as others. Please don't use the word bossy again, but do feel free to tell me if you think my requests are not appropriate. So again, it's polite, but it's firm and it's suggesting what happens moving forwards. So again, I hope that process makes sense. And in the handouts, you'll see all 4 of these steps with a worksheet where you can go through your own example in case you want to try and reflect on a conflict and apply each of these 4 ways of communicating to end up with, you know, a final email that you might send to somebody or final discussion that you might have to resolve that issue. We're just about at the end now. So to summarize what we've covered in this session, we want to use active listening to fully understand the other person's perspective when we communicate. That's really the foundation of all professional communication, because active listening builds a respectful relationship that allows you to work harmoniously. It's worth considering the boundaries of your communication, when, where, how, and what you're communicating, and whether, you know, that's appropriate. We need to protect confidentiality, both for people's, you know, personally what they've shared, but also for the organization that you represent and any information that's private to them. And we've talked about the nonviolent communication model and how you can use those 4 steps to tackle challenging topics, tackle conflicts, and use that as the basis of sending professional but polite and assertive communications about issues. So it's very much a whistle-stop tour. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there so that you can see me. There's a lot of different content. And I guess another thing that I want to emphasize as well is that when you do take on your first professional role, or any professional role, you will have somebody whose job it is to induct you, to mentor you and show you the ropes. And if in doubt, always speak to that person. Emma's going to stop the recording now, but if anybody wants to ask further questions in the chat, if you have comments that you want to make, do feel free to use this extra bit of time now to do so. Emma, is there any housekeeping that you want to share before people start disappearing for the evening?